大家下午好。首先感谢大家报名参加由伦敦发展促进署联合大华国际英国会计师事务所和泰勒信律师事务所共同举办的科技企业出海英国利好与挑战研发专场线上研讨会。我是本次会议的主持人朱玲，来自伦敦发展促进署北京办公室。那么从明年4月起，英国的研发税收抵免优惠将仅限于在英国境内开展的活动。目前符合税收抵免资格的海外研发费用届时将失去资格。为了应对这一变化，帮助企业了解英国科技现状及与之相关的商业机会，以及如何从英国政府对研发的政策和监管支出中获益，我们专门组织了这次研讨会，希望对参会来宾和公司有所帮助。这次会议为中英文双语，如果大家对这个语言选择有需要，可以按这个 Zoom 下面的中英文频道选择相应的语言。那么我们先有请第一位演讲嘉宾，伦敦发展促进署大中华区首席代表赵冰冰女士，为大家分享企业在伦敦进行海外投资及研发的优势。
谢谢 Jackie。大家早上好，或者是下午好，欢迎大家参加今天我们的线上分享：科技企业在英国布局研发板块的利好与挑战。除了拓展市场、建立品牌、搭建供应链上下游，研发也成为中国企业海外拓展的重要板块。鼓励研发是许多城市和国家重要的发展战略。英国政府呢，对各类科技企业，无论是早期创业公司，还是全球创新领导的大企业，都提供了大力的支持。而伦敦呢，是英国最重要的研发基地，利好政策为研发提供了便利，而领先完善的研发生态成为伦敦的核心竞争力，进而又吸引了更多的投资项目。在我们今天的专业合作伙伴 Kingston Smith 大华国际英国会计事务所和 Telewesting 泰勒信律师事务所具体解读研发政策前，我先介绍一下我们机构以及为什么伦敦商业生态适合所有有全球拓展计划的中国企业。下一页，谢谢。再下一页，谢谢。首先介绍一下，我们伦敦发展促进署。下一页。我们伦敦发展促进署呢，是伦敦的官方海外推广机构。我们是一个非盈利机构，主要资金来自于伦敦市政府的拨款及我们的合作伙伴。我们的主要工作就是推广伦敦，促进伦敦的商业增长和推动目的地经济。具体领域涵盖包括吸引国际企业到伦敦投资，同时也帮助伦敦优质的科技企业全球化。我们同时呢，也具备了伦敦旅游局和会展局的功能，同时为伦敦竞标国际大型活动的举办权。下一页。创造具有韧性及可持续性的包容的经济增长呢，就是我们的使命。下一页。除了伦敦总部，我们在全球5大市场有12个办公室，包括美国、印度、法国和德国。下一页。在中国呢，我们在北京、上海、深圳都有办公室。我们的深圳办公室呢，也涵盖了我们在香港、澳门和台湾的业务。我知道这次报名的企业呢，来自不同的城市和区域。今天我们3个办公室的同事也都在线上，如果后续有需要的话，欢迎跟我们联系。下一页。我们中国团队的主要工作呢，就是吸引和帮助中国企业落地伦敦。那为什么中国企业在布局海外时应该考虑伦敦呢？下一页。不管企业出海的目的是什么，我们觉得伦敦的基本优势为包括中国企业在内的国际公司提供了绝佳的商业生态环境和营商环境。主要呢有现在我们看到的几大优势。时间有限呢，我就挑几个跟大家分享一下。我觉得一个非常重要的是，伦敦有非常好的连通性。首先，英语是全球通用的商务语言，这个语言是很多，这语言的优势是很多地方是不具备的。从连通性来讲，伦敦现在有6大机场， 可以帮助企业以伦敦为基地，非常便利地达到欧洲及全球的很多地方。而有一个非常有意思的优势，就是伦敦所处在本初子午线0度时区，在伦敦建立办公室，在早晨的时候可以和亚洲的企业，在下午的时候可以跟北美的工作时区相融合。我们当时做过一个计算，在伦敦的这个工作时间涵盖了占全球99%GDP 的国家的工作时间。还有从可持续未来来讲，因为现在减排双碳都是非常热门的话题，伦敦已经制定了非常明确的目标，希望2030年实现零碳排放。在很多研发领域，对这个领域的投入是非常大的，包括在建筑、出行、排废和数字化。它的商业创新和资本的投入都是对研发有非常利好的一些政策。还有呢，从包容性来讲，其实这2天大家都非常关注的新闻是新上任的首相Rishi 苏纳克，尤其是他的印度裔背景引起了非常大的关注和讨论。但其实这也是正好伦敦多元文化性的一个体现。其实在苏纳克之前，伦敦市长 Sadiq Khan 也是巴基斯坦裔的背景。伦敦有近40%的人口是英国以外出生的，所以对伦敦来说，它不光是一个英国城市，它更是一个国际大都市。在伦敦创新公司中，每3个当中就有1个创始人是少数民族裔。所以呢，我经常套用电影《帕丁顿熊》当中的一句台词：在伦敦每一个人都是不同的，但这也意味着任何人都可以融入伦敦。而对中国企业来说，可能伦敦是一个非常相对其他城市来说是非常容易融入的一个城市。疫情前，其实在亚洲以外最大的中国年的庆祝活动，每年都是在伦敦进行的。下一页。我们团队的很多工作呢，尤其是在接触到很多企业还没有明确下一步海外拓展目的地的时候呢，我们都会提供一些城市营商数据来做一些横向比较。而这些数据呢，都是有中立的国际数据平台 FDI Market 提供的。比如说，我们经常听到的一个疑虑是伦敦很贵，在伦敦建个办公室是不是会很复杂？但其实这个表格上的一些数据就可以消除这些疑虑。比如说，在伦敦注册一家公司是非常便利的，可能只要3到7天的时间，而成本只要12英镑。但是也是实话实说，在伦敦相对来说比较复杂的是开设银行账户，但这个包括 Kingston Smith 在内的在税务方面的专家都可以为大家提供一些帮助。讲到税率，除了我们讲的研发税率，伦敦的公司税目前是19%，是 G20 国家当中最低的，而且比起很多一些其他的热门的投资城市，包括中国来说更低。研发政策这块的也是会有专家后续会具体的跟大家再做一些分享。下一页。今天参加我们活动的公司来自各行各业。在伦敦呢，其实我们把很多行业呢划为了4大重点行业集群，很多呢行业集群都是有一些传统产业和科技相结合的赋能以后产生的一些行业。今天我们介绍的研发支持，其实想要强调还有一点，这些研发的支持不仅是针对非常纯粹的科技企业，其实你不管是哪个行业的企业，包括是一些传统企业，只要你的投入是有研发性质的，都可以享受很多一些研发的便利政策。具体我也不展开了。然后呢，我们在伦敦呢有因为我们在国内的办公室是根据区域分，但是在我们伦敦的办公室就是有涵盖了不同产业的专家为大家提供落地支持。如果大家会后具体想了解哪个行业情况呢，我们也会会后进行沟通。下一页。这几年其实我们一直会被大家追问最近就是从脱欧开始，然后疫情，然后最近的地缘政治，包括能源的问题层出不穷。那伦敦和英国情况会怎么样？我觉得也是，就是在很多一些全球性的评选当中，伦敦还是保持了它的一个全球的优势地位，这也是很多评选机构对伦敦的一个肯定。也举一个小例子，很多刚刚脱欧的时候，很多大家都担心有一些原来总部在伦敦的企业都会搬离伦敦。刚开始我们也有这样的忧虑，包括比如像联合利华刚刚在英国脱欧之后呢，他们把办公室总部搬到了荷兰，但不到1年，他们又宣布把总部又搬回了伦敦。还有很多像金融行业，脱欧之后，我们当时很担心很多一些金融机构他们会把一些办公室移到欧洲的其他城市，但是相反，我们很多数据表明， 有很多原来在伦敦没有建立办公室的欧洲其他金融机构反而在伦敦加设了办公室，因为伦敦的金融城市的这个地位是无可比拟的。所以呢，我们也相信，就是之前我们讲的一个我们的使命，就是帮助需要保持伦敦有韧性、可持续的一个发展。下一页，研发呢离不开资本的支持，这2021年，英国科技公司的全年融资再创历史新高，并稳居欧洲第一，它高达398亿美元，比德国和法国加起来还多。其中呢，伦敦的科技公司呢共筹集了255亿美金，是2020年的2.3倍，排名全球第4。另外一个非常有意思的数据是表明，位于伦敦的这些创新公司越来越受到国际资本的关注。其中2021年伦敦科技公司募集到的资金75%是来自国际市场，而且其中39%是来自美国。下一页。从伦敦的研发优势来讲，具体呢我也不展开了，时间关系，就是举2个例子。下一页。伦敦其实非常重要的一点是雄厚的资本市场、高端的人才储备及完善的产业生态。其中非常关键的一点就是伦敦的人才。在伦敦居住的人口当中，有57%是受过高等教育的，而且在伦敦是欧洲技术开发人员最多的城市，有36.5万多名的开发人员。下一页。除了一会儿税务专家会介绍的税务政策，英国的签证政策也越来越有利于吸引研发人才。除了去年刚刚启动的针对应届毕业生的工作签证后，在2022年上半年，英国又推出了全球商业人才流动计划及高潜力人才签证，表明了英国特别重视全球人才的一个吸引的决心。其实我们上一期的研讨会就讨论了英国的比较便利的商业签证情况，相关资料有兴趣的朋友可以会后跟我们联系。下一页。然后举2个一个公司案例和一个行业案例。大家都知道那个 Meta 就是 Facebook， 他们其实最近是把他们的那个增强现实的 VR 总部带到了伦敦，而今年8月份，他们又把Instagram 原来的一些团队迁到了伦敦，宣布了将以伦敦作为发展他们欧洲业务的一个中心。伦敦呢也成为 Meta 在美国以外最大的工程中心，拥有了4000多名员工。另外一个领域就是医药生命科学领域，也是非常热门的一个研发产业。伦敦呢是非常理想的一个生命科学的研发基地。我前面讲到伦敦的多元文化，其实伦敦的这个多元文化来说，对医疗来说非常的重要。比如说从临床来讲，伦敦有200多种语言，然后有不同的人种，所以在做一些临床医疗的时候，伦敦提供了非常多的多元文化、多元人种的病例。还有从一个大数据来讲，因为在国内有很多医院，它其实很多的数据都是一些数据的孤岛，但是英国因为有 NHS 的全民医疗体系，它的很多的一些数据都是相互通的，所以呢，对研发来说是非常的重要。下一页。这个呢是InstaDeep 是非洲起步的一家全球领先的人工智能公司。它的创始人呢其实是出生在突尼斯，在法国跟美国留学，但最后呢选择在伦敦研发。其实我们希望以后我们在做分享的时候，能够有一家中国公司给到我们他们在伦敦做研发以后的一些评价。下一页。最后呢，介绍一下我们的服务。从2011年开始呢，我们伦敦发展促进署 全球团队已经为超过67个国家2000多家企业在伦敦设立和拓展业务，其中包括300多家中国公司。我们的服务呢是免费以及保密的。然后在今年情况比较复杂的困难的情况下呢，我们还是帮助了有18家大中华区的企业落地了伦敦，有金融科技、广告科技、电商物流、医疗健康等领域。下一页。我们为企业提供了很多一些帮助和一些支持，比如说包括一些定制化的行业报告和市场信息。下一页。然后呢，我们呢是会跟很多的专业合作伙伴，包括像今天的 Kingston Smith 和 Telewestic 类似的合作，其中呢包括招人、找办公室，然后办公室的装修，包括后续的一些市场推广，我们都会有专业的合作伙伴推荐给大家。下一页。我们也很荣幸呢，去年被评为全球最佳投资机构的亚军，希望呢就是我们的服务能够得到大家的一个肯定。下一页。最后呢，欢迎大家关注我们的微信公众号，我们会定期分享我们的产业信息和活动信息。我们也期待能够为更多的中国企业在伦敦落地发展，取得成功提供支持。谢谢。
感谢冰冰的分享。那么，如果大家对发言嘉宾有问题，可以发到这个问答的这个 box 里面。我们已经有观众提出问题了。在另外3位嘉宾演讲之后，我们会有那个 Q&A 互动环节，到时候会给大家进行解答。那么我们继续邀请第2位演讲嘉宾，大华国际英国会计师事务所合伙人 Jamie Seaford 先生为大家分享主题演讲：英国科技产业的投资机会。
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Bing Bing, for that intro. That was really good and really insightful. So, as the screen says, my name's Jamie Seaford, and I'm one of the partners at Kingston Smith in our technology sector. So we specialize in supporting tech companies based in the UK looking to expand into the UK, companies looking to expand overseas, and obviously overseas tech companies looking to expand into the UK. So today I'm going to speak a bit more about what Kingston Smith do and how we partner with London and partners to offer services around the world. I'm then going to follow on from what Bing Bing said around why the UK and specifically London is a really great place to do business and why there's a lot of opportunity there. Then going to delve into some of the opportunities as we see it, and it's specifically the subsectors of technology where we think that there's a lot of growth and a lot of opportunity for inward investment. And then we're going to speak about some practical issues that companies should be considering when they're deciding whether or not to do business in the UK. So a bit about Kingston Smith. So we are a UK-based firm. We're in the top 20 accountancy firms in the UK. We're very London focused. So you'll see on the screen there in the bottom right-hand side that we've got 6 offices based in London and around the centre of the city. So we specialize with startups, scale-ups, SMEs as they go on their growth journeys from relatively early stage all the way up to exits, listings, sales. And we've got a suite of expertise at our disposal in the various departments that can help companies on that journey. So we have corporate finance departments. We've got our obviously R&D team that are on the call with us. I'm part of our strategic growth team, helping companies make changes and grow sustainably. And our big mantra is that we can help companies, get from that very early stage right to the end of the journey without them having to look elsewhere. And the work that we partner very closely with London and Partners. So one of the initiatives we do is the Mayor's International Business Programme, and that is supporting cohorts of companies that are based in the UK and helping them look overseas. And again, that's helping them assess which markets they should be entering into. It's about linking them up with the right people overseas. And it's about, again, supporting them on making those decisions. We also, as we are doing now, support overseas London and Partners teams by introducing them to the London and UK scene. So I recently did webinars with the London and Partners team in Germany and also in the UAE. And obviously today we're doing inward investment from where you are. So even though we are part of more Kingston Smith and we are in the UK, you know, we're part of a bigger, more global network. So this is on the slide now is talking about the more UK scene. So let's say London in the bottom right hand side of the UK graphic there. There's a lot of blue dots around there, and we are most of them. But around the rest of the UK, there's a number of other more firms that we lean on and that we work with to support companies that are in the UK looking to expand into different areas. And as well as the more UK firm that we've got, you know, we're also part of more global, which is a network of accountancy firms around the world with revenues over 4 billion. We're in hundreds of countries, and there's some really good firms that we know really closely from around the world that, again, it's really useful for being able to support our clients in how they grow. And if they, you know, if they want to expand into LA, obviously we've got contacts out there. If they want to go to wherever, you know, South America, you know, we know a lot of good firms out there as well. And I say the more global network is a very impressive organization. Cool. So yeah, in terms of the UK tech sector, so I guess just building on what Bing said, you know, London and the UK is a really great place to do business, and especially in the tech sector. There are various headwinds in play at the minute, as I'm sure everyone's aware in the world, and you know, certain outward issues that are causing a few nerves in the market, as I'm sure people may have seen in the news. But it doesn't change the fact that London is a really great place to invest. And I think that first bullet point there around the unicorn. So the UK is home to 122 unicorns now, which is the first in Europe. I think 10 years ago, I think that number was 10 unicorns. So in that 10-year period, the London tech scene has really evolved massively. And I think now, the more and more that come here, you know, the more that London is still being seen as one of the world's global financial centers for tech investment. So a few other points that I say being touched on as well. So obviously the workforce expertise in London is very strong. I think we've got a lot of really good people in the UK that have worked in a number of big tech companies, and therefore have the expertise and experience to support overseas companies looking to invest in the UK. Also, as being said, the access to the US and EU markets from London gives it a real edge on different countries. So despite the fact that we Brexited, you know, the ties between the UK and Europe are still very, very strong. And a lot of our companies obviously, you know, expand into the EU and expand into the US markets. And again, despite the fact that we're no longer part of the EU, there's still a lot of trade going back and forth. And I say the tech industry hasn't been impacted too much by that. I'd say as well, so just around the opportunity to raise capital in London is very strong. So this graph here shows from our growth capital update, shows the number of deals and the deal volumes in different sectors. So you'll see that obviously information technology, as you'd normally expect, it is the largest one. There's a lot of other really exciting sectors in this graphic. I think for me personally, I do quite a lot of work in the health tech and med tech area, which is the middle graph there. And I think that healthcare sector is one that's like growing significantly as healthcare is becoming more innovative and more technological. And similarly, the bar chart on the far left there around energy, there's so much in the market now around urban solutions to, say, cars, you know, electric cars. It's not as simple as just Tesla making an electric car. It's about companies making sustainable wheels for the vehicles, sustainable parts for the cars, you know, sustainable interiors. And there's just so much to it, as opposed to what it may just seem like on the surface. So a few of the other areas we just wanted to touch on in terms of the opportunities here. So I'll combine these two, but artificial intelligence and robotics and autonomous systems. You know, the UK has become huge in terms of both of these areas. You know, I think there's a number of tech unicorns that are focused around robotics, especially being, I think, obviously having Cambridge and Oxford University is a big part of that, especially Cambridge, where the people from Arm Technologies were based and where that all grew from, which obviously a unicorn now. But again, the expertise that comes out of the UK from those universities really leads into into these kind of opportunities. And as it says there, you know, the economic markets for these kind of opportunities is huge. And the next one is fintech. And so fintech initially, so again, 10% of the global market share there is a really impressive stat considering the size of the UK. There's a lot of new innovation in the fintech space. So London and Partners do a wide range of work with fintech companies. And, you know, the stuff that we see coming out of them as in terms of banking as a service, other banking needs, there's some really impressive ideas that come to it. And there's some really, I'd say, innovative thinking that I think is really adding to the whole of the UK as an investment centre. And cybersecurity, very hot topic, I'm sure, across the world. In the UK, over the last 10 years as well, this has just exploded since there were some legislative changes that meant the UK had to become much more aware of cybersecurity in terms of compliance base. But obviously the threat of cyber attacks just keeps increasing, and even more so since COVID. And that's another sector and market which has just grown significantly over the last 5-10 years. So yeah, just a few kind of more practical examples for companies to consider when they're coming into the UK. So thinking about the registration side of it on the left-hand side. So one of the main choices for a company is whether to set up a branch or a subsidiary. So a subsidiary is a separate legal entity where the shareholders are normally the overseas company, whereas a branch is a bit less common, but it just means that you have an establishment over here, but not an actual legal entity. So the subsidiary is normally the way the companies go. So it's relatively straightforward to set up. I think it's being said, you know, it takes a number of days to get set up and nothing more complex than that. It's very cheap, and as I say, generally subsidiaries are easier to trade with in the UK. That being said, branches can be a bit easier to do if you just want to dip your toe in and just try it out for a little bit and you don't want to do the full investment into a subsidiary. Other things to think about when you're registering are registered office, which needs to be registered at our register of companies, which is Companies House, which directors you want in the company, you need at least one, and the share structure and setup. And again, that's the kind of thing that we always advise clients to think about in detail when you go to set up the subsidiary, because once it's set up, it can be quite difficult and expensive to rectify. And the last one, again, is just your accounting reference date, which I assume would be aligned with your parent company. In terms of the accounting side of it, so opening the business bank account can be arduous. The money laundering checks can take some time. So as soon as you want to start trading in the UK, you know, that's something that you should definitely be one of the first steps on the journey. VAT registration, so that's our value-added tax, which is added to the majority of services and goods that are sold in the UK. And then it's the maintaining of the accounting records, whether you do that in-house or whether you outsource it to an accountancy practice like us. Again, that's the basic bookkeeping and the recording of the information. And again, I'll speak about the annual reports in a second. So talent employment is obviously a really hot topic as well. So, you know, we have various employment taxes in the UK, such as PAYE, and we have social security taxes. The final bullet point there around tax planning of seconded employees is really important. As being said, there's a number of visas available for people in the UK. So again, before it was a lot easier to do work between the UK and the EU in terms of talent and employees, whereas now the whole world is viewed as the same state. So for a UK company to hire employees from abroad, the most common way is through a skilled worker visa. And again, there's various criteria that people need to meet to be able to satisfy that, and it takes a bit of time to get set up. But again, once you're in the process of doing that, the process it can be quite easy to do as long as you know the right way to go about it. And finally, in terms of the reporting piece on the right hand side, so again, depending on which services and how you set up in the UK, you will have to do monthly payroll reporting, quarterly VAT reporting, most likely. And in terms of the annual reporting at Companies House, you'll need to submit financial statements if you're a limited company. Again, the information is relatively limited if you're a small company, but you will still be on the public record for everyone to view free of charge. And you also need to submit a corporation tax return with HMRC. Thank you very much. Look forward to the questions in the Q&A.
谢谢 Jamie 的分享。那么如果大家对嘉宾有提问的话，可以先发到问答的那个按钮里面，我们最后进行问答互动交流。那么下面我们有请第3位嘉宾，大华国际英国会计师事务所研发税务总监 Thomas Hayden 为大家介绍英国研发税收抵免政策介绍及相关案例分享。
Thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you very much, Jamie, as well, for that wonderful overview of just what a wonderful place London is to do business. As a proud Londoner, it's fantastic to see so many people looking to do business here. So what I'd like to do today, next slide, please, is to run through what the R&D tax relief scheme is in the UK. So why is it exciting for you and what do you need to do to qualify? So we've got a bit of an agenda there. We do have some case studies at the end. I'm not going to go through those in detail during this presentation, but please feel free to ask any questions about those case studies or about how this might apply to you in the question and answer session later. So next slide, please. So to tell you a bit more about this scheme, Jamie mentioned earlier, one of the things you need to report on is corporation tax. So at the end of each year, you'll fill out a corporation tax return. And one of the things that can go in that is an R&D tax relief claim. R&D tax relief is an incentive that can get you essentially up to about 1/3 of what you spend on research and development back as either a tax credit or as a reduction in the amount of corporation tax you pay. Now, there are 2 schemes, a large company scheme and an SME scheme. The large company scheme, essentially, if your global group is more than 500 employees, then you are very likely to be under the large company scheme. It's a little bit less generous than the small and medium sized enterprises scheme, but it is a bit wider in what it allows for. The other side to that, if you're less than that, then you're obviously going to come under that SME scheme, depending on how those projects are funded. So next slide, please. Perfect. So what is an R&D activity? So R&D occurs where a project seeks to achieve an advance in a field of science or technology through the resolution of scientific or technological uncertainty. So you should be able to read that on the screen, and this is absolutely key. It breaks down into those 2 areas. Do you have an advance? So are you trying to make a technology better? Are you trying to make it step beyond the current state of the art? And are you having to overcome these challenges? So is there an element of risk to what you're trying to do? So next slide, please. So why would you, hypothetically, if you found some R&D that you're doing in the UK, what would you claim for and what's the benefit? We mentioned earlier it could be up to 1/3 of what you've spent on R&D, but what are you actually claiming for? Well, the fact is of R&D, it's mostly people time. You need people to do research and development activities. So your first cost category that you're going to be able to claim for is obviously staffing costs. Second of all to that, Jamie mentioned earlier in his presentation as to some of the different ways in which you might employ staff members. So it could be seconded staff members, it could be that you're employing contractors, it could be that you've got full employees that are employed by the UK entity. So our second cost category is essentially covering that, the fact that there are different ways of employing these staff members. So externally provided workers. So this is where you ask another company to provide you some staff members to work on your projects under your supervision, direction and control. Often what I see, particularly with businesses from overseas who are setting up in the UK, they will have employees from, for example, their China office who work on UK projects to sort of get it going at the beginning before they hire in many people in the UK. Now, we will talk about that a bit later because we are expecting some changes to that may prevent you from claiming for those costs in the future. However, I would sort of second that with so many changes in the political landscape recently, I can't be 100% certain that those will still end up occurring. So our third cost category is subcontracted activities. That's quite straightforward. And our fourth and fifth cost categories are software and consumables. So these are such things that you purchase to do your research and development with. So next slide, please. So who can apply for R&D tax credits? Well, this is one of the wonderful things about the scheme, is that there's no limitations on sector. So long as you're filling out a corporation tax return, you're undertaking activities that seek to achieve an advance in a field of science or technology, and you're having to overcome those technical uncertainties, then you're going to be able to apply to make a claim for your corporation tax return, which is it's not the same everywhere in the world, that it's so wide and it's so sector agnostic. So I think that's really important to sort of highlight there. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting question. How long can businesses enjoy the scheme? And it's not something that sort of really occurred to me until I started working with a lot of Chinese businesses investing in the UK. So here, you can make a claim every year in respect of expenditure incurred that year. So there's no limit to the point, it's not that a project must end within 5 years or must end within 3 years. Every year that you continue doing R&D, you can make a claim for that expenditure. On the flip side to that, when you first discover the R&D tax relief scheme, or you first start looking at making claims, it might be that you've already done some R&D activities. So you can actually look back 2 years and make claim for activities that you've done in the past. But yeah, there's nothing that prevents you from continually claiming each year, so long as there is still that advance you're seeking and you are still overcoming those technological uncertainties. So next slide, please. Common misconceptions. So our first misconception there is you can only claim R&D tax relief if you're a scientist working in a lab. This was absolutely something that I used to see 4 or 5 years ago, businesses saying, I can't possibly be doing R&D because, I just employ software engineers, we work in fintech, and that's not the case. So long as there is a field of technology that is being advanced, there's a state of the art with regard to that field of technology, and you're stepping beyond it, then you can make a claim. The second one, you cannot make a claim if your project is not successful. Now, an unsuccessful R&D project is a really good demonstrator of technological uncertainty, because you don't set out to fail a project. You set out to achieve it, or you set out to try and achieve it. So it can be a really good demonstration of R&D itself. So yeah, there's no requirement to actually achieve the advance you're seeking to achieve. You just need to have attempted to achieve it. You cannot make a claim if your business has received a grant. Now, this one's an interesting one. It does have an effect, receiving a grant, on what you can claim and how you go about claiming it, but it doesn't rule out you making a claim. So one of the really nice things is you might have received, essentially had your project funded by a grant, and actually you can still claim for that expenditure under the large companies scheme, even if you're an SME, under the large companies scheme. So you're almost getting sort of double bubble as such. I'm not sure how you're going to translate that term, double bubble, but you're getting double the amount or extra as a result of this scheme. So our number 4 there is you cannot make a claim if your business is not making a profit. As mentioned at the beginning, yes, it is a corporation tax relief scheme, but there is a tax credit element to that. So obviously, if you're making a profit and you therefore are owing a certain amount in corporation tax to HMRC, the UK tax authorities, then they're not going to pay you out a credit. They're just going to net that off against what you owe. But on the other side to that, if you are loss making and you're not therefore owing any corporation tax, then you will get essentially cash paid into your bank account, which can be fantastic for early stage startups, as not a lot of those do make profits at the beginning of their life as businesses. And number 5, you cannot make a claim if you subcontracted R&D work or if you are subcontracted to do R&D work by another company. So again, this is an interesting one, and similar to point 3 about receiving a grant. What it essentially affects is which scheme you're going to be able to claim under. So an SME can't have been subcontracted to by another business to do that R&D work. However, the large company scheme does allow for that, and therefore that business could make a claim under the large company scheme. Yes, the large company scheme is less generous than the SME scheme, but looking at it another way, if you've been subcontracted to do the work, then you're already receiving funding towards achieving that R&D. Next slide, please. Okay, fantastic. So these are our case studies. I'm hoping that a copy of this presentation is going to go out to everyone after this. So rather than read through these, I think it makes more sense to leave people to read these in their own time. However, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in our session later. And thank you very much for all your time.
感谢 Thomas 从这个实际操作的角度为我们分享的内容。那么我们现在邀请出最后一位演讲嘉宾，泰勒信律师事务所竞争法、贸易和外商投资团队负责人 Paolo Palmigiano 为大家介绍英国国家安全与投资法。
Jackie, thank you very much. What I wanted to cover in the next few minutes is a new piece of legislation which came into force at the beginning of this year, and it impacts many transactions within the UK. But before I do so, I'll give you a very quick introduction about myself and Telewesting. Next, please. I am the head of competition, trade and foreign investment in London and in Brussels for Telewesting, and I've been a competition lawyer for most of my life. Next, please. You might not be familiar with Telewesting, but Telewesting is a leading international law firm which has offices across Europe, but also offices in China and Hong Kong. And we have a dedicated Chinese desk here in London to help companies when they are setting up business in the UK. So we assist them when they are planning to expand internationally. Next, please. And we are very strong in 4 sectors: technology, media and communication, real estate, life sciences and healthcare and private wealth. But we also service clients in a lot of other sectors: financial institutions, fintech was mentioned, hotels, manufacturing. Next slide, please. And this is just a very quick introduction of the clients we have in China and we service regularly. Next, please. So I've given you an introduction of Telewesting, and I wanted to talk about what's happening in the UK. Next slide, please. The UK, you know, many countries have rules about foreign investments in those countries. And the UK, for the last 20 years, has been actually very, very light touch. We had a regime where whenever there was a big merger, then the Secretary of State could look at the deal if it raised issue of national security, media plurality, financial stability, or more recently, the capability to combat and mitigate the effects of public health emergencies. And the number I put beside the headings is actually the number of interventions that was made from 2002 to 2021. So as you can see, very small number. But what has happened from 2022 is national security comes out from the old regime, and it has a completely new regime. Next slide, please. And as I was saying, it started early this year on the 4th of January, 2022. Next. So what is and why are we talking about this here? I think, first of all, I think the point to understand, this is not a foreign investment regime. So it does not apply only to foreign investors in the UK, but it's a national security regime. What that means is that it applies to investors of any country. And that includes, believe it or not, acquisition by UK companies of UK companies. It has a wide remit. For example, internal reorganization or restructuring are captured if it has an impact on the company which carries the activities I will discuss later. It's not only acquisition of companies, which is subject to the regime, but also acquisition of land or intellectual property. And most importantly, also for the audience here, it also applies to transaction acquisition which take place outside of the UK, a Chinese company buying a Chinese company, or a Chinese company acquiring a German company. If that company, the target, carries out activities in the UK or supply goods or services to persons in the UK. So for example, if you have a Chinese company which carries out R&D in the UK and it's been acquired by a Chinese company, that might be subject to a filing here in the UK. And there are other activities, for example, having an office makes the transaction captured by the Act, or even overseeing the activities of a subsidiary that carries on activities in the UK. So it's quite wide. Next, please. But what does it mean? What does the regime mean for investors in the UK? And there are two parts of the regime which are very different principles. We have a mandatory system and we have a voluntary system. Next slide, please. I'll start with the mandatory one, which is obviously the one that raises the most issues. So if the target, the company that is being acquired, is active in one of 17 sectors, which are defined in legislation and which I'll list shortly, and it carries activities within the definition in those 17 key sectors. For example, an airport of more than 6 million passengers, and there is a trigger event, for example, the acquisition of shares of voting rights as low as 25%, then a mandatory filing must be made to the government. There are no turnover thresholds, so even if the company is not making money, even if the company has 2 employees, a filing is required. And it doesn't matter whether there are or not national security issues. The fact that the company is in that sector, the fact that there is a trigger event means filing is needed. And the consequences for not filing are quite harsh. First of all, the transaction is void if not notified. There are substantial fines, which can be up to 5% of the total worldwide turnover of the 2 companies, or 10 million, whichever is great. But also there is imprisonment for the individuals up to 5 years. And one other effect, which is actually the one our clients are always most concerned, is the fact that parties cannot complete, once they file, parties cannot complete until they get clearance. So they have to wait for a certain period of time. Next slide, please. So what are the 17 key sectors that the government is interested? Here's the list, and it's quite wide. From the more obvious ones, there are others which are quite, transport, for example. So the notification is required if the target is active in advanced material, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, civil nuclear, communications, computing hardware, critical supplies to government, critical supplies to the emergency services, cryptographic authentication, data infrastructure, defense, energy, military and dual use, quantum technologies, satellite and space technology, synthetic biology, and transport. And the legislation has a very lengthy definition of what is captured, for example, under advanced material. What must the company do to be captured under that sector? And remember, it's not just producing things, but it's also R&D in many of those sectors. Next, please. So I mentioned there's a mandatory filing, but I mentioned there's also a voluntary filing. Why do a voluntary filing to the government? The government believes that when the target, the company being acquired, is in one of those 17 key sectors, but outside the definition, for example, an airport which has less than 6 million customers, then a voluntary filing might be necessary if the transaction raises national security issues. And for acquisition of land or IP, it's only voluntary. So you might ask, well, if it's voluntary, why do it? The reason why many companies do notify even under the voluntary section is because if the transaction is not notified, it is true there are no fines, but the government has 5 years to call in the transaction for review. So that means that for 5 years, there's the possibility that the government might intervene, start investigating, and actually stopping the transaction or ordering divestment. So clearly, as you can imagine, many companies, if they are captured and they think there are national security issues, then they tend to file. Next, please. I mentioned earlier on that there has to be, the target must be in one of those 17 key sectors, and there must be a trigger event. So what is a triggering event? It is listed here. It is basically the gaining of control of shares and voting rights, which increase from 25% or less to more than 25%, from 50% or less to more than 50%, from less than 75 to 75% or more. And each time there is an increase, a new filing is needed. For example, a company which buys a target active in one of the 17 key sectors, 30%, they have to do a filing. Next year, they increase their shareholding to 55, then a new filing has to be done. And in addition to that, there is a very general clause catching it all that says one of the other mandatory criteria for filing is the acquisition of voting rights that enable or prevent the passage of any class of resolution governing the affairs of the entity being acquired. So in a way, it is any control that the buyer can exercise on the target. In relation to voluntary filing, it's the same criteria. There's actually a new one, which is even lower, which is the ability to materially influence the policy of the entity, which in many cases might be as low as 16%. Next. I'm not going to talk on this slide, but I thought it was useful to capture here the differences between the two regimes, so you have an idea of when it's triggered and what it means. Next, please. It seems so gloom and doom, as we say in English, but actually there are a few things which are quite acceptable. The first is the filing. The filing is done online, and actually it is quite simple. It doesn't take a long time to do a filing in the UK under this regime. It's very different from the US CFIUS, where we all know there are very, very strict requirements. So filing is quite easy. And once a filing has been done, there is a review process by the government which lasts 30 working days. And usually at the end of the 30 working days, most of the time, the transaction is cleared. But there's been a few instances where the government has concerns and they call the transaction in for a second review period, what is called an assessment period. Again, is 30 working days. But in this second phase, if the government sends requests for information, then the clock stops. So that means, obviously, the assessment period can be much longer than 30 working days. At the end, again, we can have clearance. We can have a clearance with condition, or in extreme cases, a prohibition. There's also a further process, which is an extension. If the government during the assessment period hasn't done fully the analysis and it has still serious concern, then there can be another period of 45 working days, but it requires the consent of the purchaser. All of this process is not public. The only thing that becomes public is whether a deal has been blocked or whether condition has been imposed. So, for example, there's been a clearance, but there's been a clearance with conditions. Next, please. And the government has started to intervene. And unfortunately for the audience here, both cases so far where there's been a prohibition involve Chinese companies. The first prohibition decision was in July this year, and it was an IP agreement. It was a license agreement between a university and Beijing Infinite Technology Company. And it was something you will say quite innocuous. It is a vision-sensitive technology for toys, for children. So that technology can enable next generation of autonomous robots. Why was it blocked? Because the government thought that that technology had dual-use application, civil and military, and therefore it didn't allow the transfer of the license for the university to Beijing Infinite Technology. And the second one was in August 2020, which was an acquisition of a UK company which is active in integrated circuits by Hong Kong-based firm Super Orange UK. Again, this technology could be used for military or civilian, and therefore it was blocked. Now, the fact that the two first prohibition decisions are Chinese, that doesn't mean that all the transactions involving Chinese companies will be blocked. I've had several filings I've done for Chinese company where no issues at all were raised. What I can say with the experience I have had so far of the regime is whenever the target has something to do with military, as a dual use agreement with the Ministry of Defense, that's when the government becomes quite nervous. For all other acquisition by Chinese buyers of UK companies, I haven't seen the same sensitivity, and therefore they're being cleared quite easily. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the conclusion. It is a regime which, as I say, is starting to bite. There are still transactions under investigation. We will know soon what the outcome is. And what I can say is obviously the UK has now one of the highest levels of scrutiny on national security in the world. The filing is not complex. I think for most clients, especially startup venture, the standstill obligation is what causes concerns. And I haven't seen yet an effect on investment. What is interesting is the day the act was published on the 4th of January, the same day the government issued a big document stating how the UK was open for business for Chinese companies and saying all the good things about the UK for Chinese investors in the UK. And unless there is a substantial change in the geopolitical situation, clearly, I would say, as it's been said already earlier on, the UK is still a good place for doing business, even for UK companies. Thank you. That brings me to the end, and obviously I look forward to questions at the end.
谢谢 Polo 为我们带来的对国家安全法的解析那么我们现在进入问答环节，然后这个环节在进行的时候，大家也还可以把你们的问题发到那个问答的对话框里面。那么我们首先第一个问题可能还是涉及到法律的问题。这位观众提的问题是，请问在西方政府对中国企业增加限制的背景下，中国科技企业去伦敦会不会有政策风险？具体到区块链产业，需不需要这方面的担心？ 我们看一下哪位嘉宾愿意先来回答一下这个问题。
Happy to answer from the perspective of the Act. As I was saying, the Act captures acquisitions of company. So in relation to setting up a new company, which carries R&D, for example, or is a technology company by a Chinese investor, that's not an issue. As I say, the Act only bites when you acquire a company. So no, from my perspective, no obstacles to Chinese investing in the UK and setting up new companies.
谢谢 Paulo。那我们现在来看下一个问题。这个其实第2个和第3个问题其实可以合并为一个问题，就是办事处或分公司可以开展研发活动或经营活动吗？比如子公司、办事处、分公司是否有经营范围的限制？我们看看是不是Kingston Smith 的2位嘉宾更适合回答下面这2个问题呢
Yeah, I mean, I can give an answer from the R&D tax perspective, but I think the general answer to those questions is yes. But the R&D from an R&D tax relief perspective, yeah, subsidiary will still be filling out a corporation tax return, and therefore will still be able to claim R&D. There's no limit or restriction on what sort of activity, what sort of R&D activity that needs to be. So you're not treated any differently as a Chinese business, for example, than a UK business would be. So I think that's a key. Is there any restriction for activity on branch, subsidiary, or reps? I guess that's realistically the same question. Oh, yeah, there's a 4th question that's just popped up there. As this is another R&D one, shall I, Jamie, do you want to say your bit?
I was going to say, just on the restrictions, there's no specific restrictions per se, but obviously certain activities are restricted. So if you're working in financial services, for example, there's certain regulations around that which you have to be aware of and be registered for with the FCA. You know, there's similar restricted industries like that, but nothing specifically for overseas investment.
Cool. And then we got a question on the interaction of video games tax relief and R&D tax credits. It's an interesting point because it will depend on exactly which activities you're doing. Naturally, you can't just double up on these things, but depends exactly, you know, what's in your video games tax relief claim. So stuff that's not in your video games tax relief claim, you're going to be able to look at and judge whether or not that meets the R&D tax credits definition. I would always recommend with that sort of thing, unless you're, unless you're very, very well versed in this, get someone in to have a look at it. Get someone in to double check that that you are picking up the right bits of expenditure in the right way under the right scheme. There's many different ways in which you can sort of look at these things. So definitely worth getting advice there, I think, for that one. And if you'd like to speak to us afterwards, please contact us. What's our next question? If the parent company is an international conglomerate, can the subsidiary in the UK still apply the tax relief as a small and medium enterprise? Yeah, great question. So the definitions of a small and medium enterprise apply to the whole group as such. So it includes any linked partner, etc., enterprises. So what you'll generally find, although you might look at it as in the UK, it's only a 10-person business, because it's part of that wider group, you're going to have to consider all of the whole group, so the whole international conglomerate, when applying your ceiling tests. So when applying your test of 500 employees, of turnover of less than 100 million euros, etc., etc. You're depending on the size, essentially, is the answer to that, of that international conglomerate. I mean, people don't normally use the term international conglomerate unless it's not absolutely massive. So I would assume not, but again, always worth looking at. So we've got another couple of questions. I think those might be questions for Paolo and Jamie. Questions.
Yes. So number 6, regarding a UK entity ownership transfer or share transfer from British citizens to Chinese citizens, is there any restriction? So I don't think there's any specific restriction, but definitely on the company record on Companies House, the information that's available to the public around who owns that company will then be changed from whoever the previous owner was to the current owner, because in terms of every UK company has to list on Companies House who the beneficial owners are, and then whoever you interact with may need to update their anti-money laundering and KYC checks. But again, no specific restriction as far as I'm aware. And is it legal to use software cloud service in Frankfurt, Germany for London user? Yeah, that's totally legal. The UK companies in the UK use a range of services from the EU and from Europe. Yeah, so that's totally fine.
And I can take number 8. First of all, is not every piece of land. It's only land which is critical. So, for example, it's land which could be close to a nuclear plant or to a military installation. What are the consequences if that piece of land is being bought, for example, by, I don't know, an Iranian company? Well, if the government wants, they can ask to review the acquisition of land, and in practice, actually, they could order divestment of that piece of land to sell it to somebody who do not raise national security issues.
那么我们下面还有一个问题，可能比较适合伦敦发展促进署来回答。有观众问，在伦敦是否有科技的聚集区？如果在伦敦设立一个科技公司的办公室，有哪些区域可以推荐？那我们请冰冰回答一下这个问题。
其实科技这个概念很广啊，就是我刚刚在 chat 里面发了一下我们的一个网址。其实，在我们的网页上面会对具体的一些科技领域，在伦敦适合选择的地区做了一些推荐。打比方来说，我刚刚前面提到的关于医疗产业的话，那在伦敦可能有4个区，比如说是 Wessing， 或者是可能现在那个叫Cross， 就是它会有一些已经有的比较活跃的一些生态圈在那边，比如说是有比较好的大学呀，或者说已经有比较好的研发工作室。然后呢，像现在比较热门的关于比如说沉浸式科技，或者是说是广告科技。那我们在伦敦的东部有一个地方叫 Hayden， 就是之前在伦敦奥运会时候的媒体中心，那边聚集了大量的多媒体，然后是沉浸式科技 VR 领域的公司。所以呢，具体讲到科技这个概念的话，也要看这个公司具体是从事哪个领域。如果大家访问我们这个网站的话呢，能够看到我们有个互动地图，它列了大概近10个不同的分产业 subset， 然后你点击进去之后，你就能看到在这个产业的生态圈是怎么样。比如说是哪些研发机构，哪些是大的公司聚集地，哪些是一些你的类似的公司，或者是一些就是政府审查机构，都在这个互动地图上面都可以找到。也欢迎具体的话，大家某个产业就是需要我们一些具体的推荐，比如说我可能是差不多50个人，然后我现在的主要的服务对象是哪些产业的，然后在伦敦找办公室或者是选择的时候，我们也有其他的合作伙伴可以帮忙 推荐办公室。谢谢。
谢谢冰冰。那其他观众还有什么问题吗？我们其实之前也收集了一些公司的问题，可能最后再提2个问题吧。第一个问题是讲我的公司是在2020年于英国成立的，但是我在今天这个研讨会之前都不知道可以申请研发的税费优惠。那么我还可以申请在2020年就开始就是进行研发上面的一些税务的减免吗？还是说我只能从2022年可以申请这方面的税收优惠？
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned earlier that you can actually look back 2 years as such. Now that depends on your company year end in the UK. So let's hypothetically say that your financial period runs from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, which I would say is the most logical year to have. Then you would be able to look at that 2020 year and that 2021 year, but any activities you did in 2019 would be off the table and you couldn't look at them anymore. So when I say look at, I mean claim. Your deadline for that 2020 year, depending on what your year end will likely be in the next few months, it would be 31st of December for a 31st of December year end. I'm not sure who answered or who asked the question, but the answer is essentially yes, quite possibly. But I would get someone to have a look at it.
谢谢 Thomas。那么我们还有最后一个问题是关于增值税的注册问题。增值税的注册在英国是强制的吗？
Yeah, so it's definitely not mandatory when you're a very small company, but as soon as your VAT taxable turnover, which in essence is all the sales that you are going to make that are standard VAT rated, VAT rated. So as soon as that goes above £85,000 sterling, then that's when you need to register for VAT, and that becomes mandatory. What are the benefits for tech companies to register for VAT? So depending on the type of services or goods you're supplying, you may be in a position where you can reclaim VAT on your expenditure on certain things that you're paying that are standard VAT rated, and you may not be charging VAT on your sales. So it may be that you're constantly in a repayment position from HMRC, which may result in you receiving cash repayments from them. As I say, it will depend a bit on the business and the activities that you're undertaking, but it's definitely something to consider. And again, probably speaking to a VAT expert is probably the best place to start.
谢谢 Jamie。刚才有一位观众又追加了一个问题他的问题是给冰冰的，关于刚才提到的沉浸式科技的科技聚集区在伦敦是哪里区域的名字？
应该是有不少几个区域都是非常活跃在这里面。我之前提到的有个区域叫 Hayden East， 在伦敦的东边，是之前2012年伦敦奥运会所在的那个区域。Hayden East 它聚集了大量的关于沉浸式科技和多媒体科技的一些孵化器和一些国际公司都在那边，包括Seaford 它的很多一些的演播室都在那边。
刚才又追加了一个问题，关于注册子公司超过固定金额需要缴纳离印税吗？这个观众提的问题比较专业，我们看看哪一位财务的专家可以回答一下。
What was the question? Sorry.
注册子公司超过固定的金额需要缴纳 什么特别的税收吗？
So, sorry, could you repeat it again? Sorry.
I think her question is when registering a company and the registered amount of money, if
Okay.
it exceeds a certain amount, if there's any specific tax to be paid in the UK.
Okay, so no, so the rate, the cost for incorporating the company in the UK is the same flat rate, and that is, you know, very minimal. As I say, certain, I'll probably leave it there actually.
Okay, I think that's great. So a sweet ending for today. So shall we call it a day here, and wish you have a nice day and rest of the week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much, everyone.
Bye-bye.